Welcome everybody. It's great to see yet again such a great turnout for another one of our CHASM lunchtime seminars. Today we are welcoming our very own. We're not going too far afield today, so we're welcoming Danny McGowan, who is Professor of Finance here at University of Birmingham, and he's also head of the finance department. And Christoph Görtz, who is a senior lecturer in macroeconomics. I'm going to try and get this right, Danny and Christoph, but I believe Danny's specialism is applied microeconomics with a particular focus on banking and financial intermediation. He's also done some work on mortgage markets, he's just told me. And Christoph's work is more centered around uncertainty, news, business, cycles. Again, correct me if I've got that wrong, please, Christoph. So I was just saying to Danny that it's perhaps fair to say that some of their most recent work, and particularly that which is the subject of today's CHASM seminar, represents maybe a slight departure from your usual work in that this is more focused on outcomes at the kind of individual and household level, which is many of you who know CHASM and know our work, that is what we do. We're concerned with sort of financial security at the individual and household level in particular. So if everything is all right with you guys and you're happy to crack on, I'm going to hand over to Danny, who I think is going to be doing the presentation. We've got about half an hour, Danny. I'll give you a 5-minute warning, but 35 minutes max, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Louise. And thanks to Louise, Helen, and Karen for organising this seminar. I take it you can all see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Great. Okay, let's plow ahead then. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for coming today. This is a joint piece of work with Christoph Görtz and Mallory Yeromonahos. And what we do in this is to ask whether being furloughed during the pandemic period influences households' financial distress. Now, if you don't want to sit through the rest of this talk, the key takeaways are that yes, it did, although the effects are small in terms of how it affects the UK workforce overall. Increasing government's contributions to workers' wages during furlough wouldn't actually mitigate financial distress, and these effects are primarily concentrated amongst people in the lower half of the income distribution and those with educational qualifications below university degrees. We also find that furlough provokes other responses, notably cuts in people's consumption expenditure, and it also leads to wealth inequality as they draw down savings. Okay, so unless you've been living under a rock for the last 18 months, this will be familiar. During spring last year, it became quickly evident to most people, aside from some policymakers, that a national lockdown was required to contain the spread of COVID-19, and that was subsequently implemented on March 23rd. As businesses and other employers shut their operations to try and comply with the stay-at-home order, it became apparent that mass unemployment was a realistic possibility. And to try and confront the pandemic, the UK government introduced a series of unprecedented economic policies to try and deal with it. One of those was the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, or Furlough scheme, I'll talk about today. And under that scheme, employers have discretion about whether and for how long to furlough a worker, during which the government pays 80% of their gross wages, up to 2.5K per month, and they also pay some national insurance and pension contributions as well. There's a number of reasons why the furlough scheme was implemented, primarily to prevent large negative income shocks. Moving from 100% wages to unemployment benefits in the UK is a substantial reduction, and much bigger compared to other countries in Europe. There's also employer benefits. It allows them to reduce cost pressures by getting rid of labour costs, but it also allows employers to retain employee relationships. That means they can quickly restart operations after a national lockdown ends, rather than incur hiring costs, both monetary and time. From the start, it was obvious that this scheme would continue as long as the pandemic, really, and the government made that very clear in its initial introduction of the scheme announcement. It was subsequently close to non-furloughed workers on June 10th this year, and it ended at the end of September. Okay, so you can see a familiar pattern here. The blue line shows the daily number of COVID positive tests in the UK, and the red line shows the number of furloughed workers. The grey areas are the national lockdowns. What you can see is at the start of the pandemic, almost 9 million people were on furlough, and the number ebbs and flows inversely related to the COVID infection rate. By the end of this sample period in June, there were still almost 2 million people on furlough, and by September of this year, 1.5 million still remained on it. They're mostly older workers and confined to specific industries. And what we're interested in is, well, how does furlough affect financial distress? And we don't have an economic model of that or any theory behind this. It's pretty simple. If you're getting a large reduction in your wages, what happens? Well, the shock to wages here is quite big. On average, a furloughed worker experienced a 17% decline in monthly earnings. Okay, and you can see that for some people, they don't experience much of a reduction. Okay, somewhere between 0 and 5%. But there are some people that experience income falls of between 40 and 80% a year or per month. These are typically workers on extremely high salaries that get furloughed and end up earning 2.5K a month. Okay, so what we ask in this paper is furlough associated with financial distress? Are those effects unequally distributed across society? And what other kinds of household responses do we observe in the data? Do people change their behavior to try and deal with this and live within their budget? And would changing the government's contribution improve household level outcomes? So we think that these are important welfare issues to address. It's also important to evaluate the scheme given the burden that it places on public finances. So almost £70 billion have been dispersed through the furlough scheme in wage subsidies. That's 8% of the UK government's annual budget. So designing a scheme like this in a cost-effective way matters for taxpayers. And it's also important it's designed effectively in case this has to be introduced in future in response to, say, further waves of infection, or in the event that furlough becomes part of the institutional environment in the same way as it is in, say, Germany or Switzerland, where it's used to address recessions. Okay, so how do we evaluate this question? We rely on data provided by Understanding Society, which is a data provider most of you will be familiar with. And specifically, we use their COVID-19 survey. So this is a special web-based survey conducted at 8 points in time during the crisis. So we're able to observe an individual 8 times between April 1st, 2020 and the end of April this year. So our data set spans almost the entire time during which these workers could be furloughed. We have information on a range of household, demographic and socioeconomic characteristics for each person. Measuring financial distress, as Louise and everyone else in CHASM will tell you, is tricky because it's a nebulous concept and it spans many different things. We're going to focus on 2 outcomes that we can easily measure: whether someone is late on housing payments or if they're late on bill payments. There's good and bad reasons to look at those, but one of the reasons we do so is because falling behind on those types of payments is typically an indicator of severe financial distress. They're also 2 of the largest expense items in people's monthly budget. On top of that, we also know about people's start and end date on the furlough scheme. Okay, so we can precisely observe whether they are or are not furloughed. And we have a ton of additional information on their age, monthly pay, and so on. But also COVID-specific information about whether they're on a mortgage holiday, which is another policy implemented by the government in conjunction with lenders, whether they've tested positive, whether they're shielding due to an NHS shielding letter, and so on. I'm more than happy to talk about that later if people want more information. Furlough is, of course, something that can only happen to someone in employment. And for that reason, our sample here only contains people who are employed during the sample period. Okay, so we're going to exclude retirees, the unemployed, and those who are self-employed. There is a furlough scheme for the self-employed, SEISS, but its design is somewhat different, and there's good econometric reasons why we don't look at them. More than happy to talk about that as well later. We also merge in historic vintages of the Understanding Society database because the people who appear in the COVID-19 special survey, they're also surveyed during normal times, for, well, pre-2020 as well. So we know a lot of their characteristics about whether they have a history of financial distress, pre-pandemic income, and so on. Now, one of the real benefits of this survey is that it uses a complex survey design, and that means it features stratification and non-random sampling. It also contains weights that allow us to construct a representative sample of the UK population. So the estimates we show here are not just relevant to our sample, they generalize to the entire UK population. Okay, let me start by just giving you some overview of the characteristics of the people who are furloughed during the pandemic. So you can see the 8 points in time that we observe them in our data here. And you can see some characteristics such as their age. So the average furlough worker at the start of the pandemic was about 43 years old, stayed about that until September, October last year, and then began to fall. Okay, so furlough started as an older phenomenon, then workers became younger. And if we were able to extrapolate to subsequent months using different data sets, you'd see it becomes an older phenomenon by the end of the pandemic. You can see something similar playing out with their pre-pandemic net pay. Okay, so their monthly pay after paying tax and pension contributions. It starts at about £1,400 per month, and by the end it's fallen to £1,200. So it's certainly poorer people, or perhaps not poorer, but less well-paid people that are furloughed as the pandemic progresses. As you'd expect, most people on the furlough scheme don't have a university degree. They're certainly in the majority, which is consistent with the fact that it's mainly people in public-facing retail roles that are furloughed. And the share of people who are managers on furlough is understandably quite small. It's primarily a phenomenon associated with people who are in intermediate roles or routine jobs as defined by understanding society. And we've heard a lot in the media about how minorities have been adversely affected by the pandemic. What you can see is that they account for somewhere between 4 and 8% of furloughed workers, which is less than their overall share in the UK workforce. There's a fairly even gender divide across most of these sample periods, although there are some months in which women are more likely to appear as the furloughed pool. Okay, so I promised Louise that this wouldn't be overly technical and I wouldn't just cover my slides with algebra, which she feared. This is all going to be quite straightforward, but I do need to talk about one equation here. So what we're going to do here is something very basic. We're going to estimate probit models to try and establish how the probability of being late on those financial distress outcomes is related to being on furlough. Okay, so that's going to be this coefficient beta here. Okay, now one of the limitations of that framework is that we can't attribute causality, because while being placed on furlough is primarily something that's chosen by an employer, there's always the potential that it correlates with something else that explains financial distress. So we're quite conservative with our interpretations of these effects. In these models, at least, they're correlations rather than causal inferences. I'll skip all this stuff below because that's just boring. Okay, the other type of estimation strategy we use here is to use something called propensity score matching that some of you may have encountered before. What we're essentially trying to do is to find people who are furloughed that are very similar to those who are not furloughed. And the idea is that by comparing these very similar individuals, then the estimates are much more likely to be causal in nature. Okay, so if someone's got the same level of pay, they're a similar age, and they're from a similar educational background, it's plausible that the person who's furloughed is, or that furloughed is chosen for a more random decision that's related to the firm's optimal staffing constraints. Okay, so in these estimates, we're much more willing to call these estimates causal. You feel free to disagree with me and tell me that's wrong. We're more than happy to make revisions. Whenever we match these people, we're doing so based on their age, monthly income, degree, minority ethnicity status, their gender, the region they live in, household composition in terms of number of adults, kids, and also the COVID infection rate in the area where they live. Okay, so to give you an idea of what we're doing here, we get some number from that process, say 0.5, that's between 0 and 1. And this says that someone with these underlying characteristics has a probability of 50% that they're furloughed. We're then going to choose people that are very similar to them, okay, within a range of 5 percentage points either side. And this person would end up being in our sample. If there's no one to match to, then we discard them, okay? That's as much technicality as you need. What we'd expect, though, is that if this type of procedure is well done, if our algorithm works well, what we should see is the characteristics of these people in our match sample are highly similar and comparable. So to give you an example, the red and blue lines show the monthly pay for furloughed and non-furloughed workers in these graphs. And on the left, we've got the raw data. What you can see here is that the furloughed individuals tend to be, well, they tend to have lower monthly pay. However, after we run our match, you can see these lines are highly overlapping. They're very similar. So we've got some confidence in these quasi-experimental approaches that it gives us something that is perhaps causal in nature about the effect of furlough. Does it cause financial distress rather than just correlate with it? Okay, so what do we find? Well, here's our baseline estimates. What we've plotted here is the effect of furlough on the probability of financial distress. So if I'm furloughed relative to someone who's not, how much does that increase or potentially decrease the probability that I am late on either housing or bill payments? And we've got this for different types of people. So our baseline estimate is that for our entire sample, furlough increases the probability that you're late on housing by about 2 percentage points. The vertical lines here show the confidence intervals around these point estimates. And what you can see in these first two instances is that none of these overlap 0. Okay, so we're reasonably confident these are not zero effects. They're statistically significant at 5% levels. Okay, so we're 95% confident this isn't driven by just sampling variation. This seems like a real effect. However, what you can see is that it's only renters who experience financial distress in terms of late housing payments, not mortgagees. We'll talk about that in a moment. If we turn to late bill payments, we see the same type of pattern of results, albeit there's a level effect. There's a higher probability here. Okay, so renters are about 5 percentage points more likely to be late on bills if they're furloughed compared to someone who's a renter that isn't on furlough. Again, for mortgagees, so people who own a house through a mortgage, we don't find any significant effects there. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions then. First of all, how big are these effects? Well, the incidence of late housing payments amongst those people who are not furloughed is low during the sample period. Only 2.5% of them are late on housing. That means that this 2.13 percentage point increase in the probability of late housing payments is actually large in relative terms. Okay, it's an 85% increase compared to those people who aren't furloughed. And for late bill payments, it constitutes a 31% increase. Okay, so these are large relative effects. However, if you calculate how much this actually adds up to in terms of the whole UK workforce, what you can see is that for the entire workforce, furlough increases the incidence of financial distress by about 2 percentage points. Okay, and that's a fairly modest amount, we'd argue. The only reason it looks big is because you're comparing it against people who have a fairly low incidence of financial distress. The other question that comes out of those estimates is, why is it only renters? Why do they experience financial distress and not mortgagees? Well, what we argue in the paper is that mortgagees are able to use mortgage holidays, that they can defer housing payments for between 3 and 6 months during the pandemic. So this was something introduced by government as well as major mortgage lenders at the start of the pandemic to try and provide mortgagees with breathing room. And it was partly for that reason, but it was also partly to try and prevent the banking sector experiencing a wave of delinquencies that would have put pressure on the financial sector in the UK. Okay, so why is this useful for mortgagees? Well, they can effectively defer housing payments. Their mortgage will become more expensive in the future, because interest continues to accrue during that period. But this allows them to free up cash flow that they can then use to remain current on bills. There's no such scheme available to renters. And for them, average rent typically accounts for about 30% of their monthly expenditure, which means that whenever they experience a 17% income shock, remaining current on that can be very tricky. I've got a question from Amalia asking, have we looked to see what happens inside mortgage brackets, if there's a difference? We can't do that with the data as far as I'm aware at the moment, but it's a good question. It's something we'll look into. Okay, so what we can see here then is a graph where we plot the decline in someone's income due to furlough on the x-axis and the probability that they're late on either housing or bill payments. You can see the familiar average decline in income during furlough here. Now, there's something really interesting here, we argue. Below a 20% decline in income due to furlough, so that's everyone who's furloughed, the government make contributions, but their employer chooses not to, at 20%. And then for these guys below that level, the employer makes some contribution. Below this level, that line's essentially flat. Okay, so increasing the generosity of government contributions from, say, 80 to 90% of workers' wages while furloughed, that's going to have no effect on the probability of financial distress. Okay, so increasing the generosity of the system probably wouldn't have done much to help households. Why is that? Well, there's lots of evidence, particularly from Christopher Girardi in the United States, that shows it's only really when you experience huge income shocks that people default on mortgage payments and bill payments as well. So it's only where that's inevitable they follow that route. Otherwise, they make other choices to try and remain within budget. However, what you can see is that this line is highly nonlinear. Okay, so if we move to a 40% or 60% decline in income during furlough, the effect of that on the probability of financial distress is huge. It's about 70% increase at a 60% reduction. You might ask, well, are those effects, can we be confident in them because there's not many people experiencing 80% income reductions during furlough? And the answer is, well, yeah, if we were to plot confidence intervals around this, and I should have shown that graph, these are not non-zero effects. These are true, well, statistically significant effects. Okay, so essentially, would changing the government's contribution make things better? Probably not. I think this speaks to the effective design of the scheme, which in some ways is quite surprising, given that it was designed over the course of a weekend by a couple of guys in the Treasury. It seems like this is a good way of minimizing public expenditure, whilst also minimizing the incidence of financial distress within the workforce. I'm reluctant to say whether we can extrapolate this to other settings, like in Germany, where there are lower government contributions, given the design of the UK's furlough scheme is much more generous compared to other places, but you could use it as a benchmark of the lower bound or perhaps upper bound if you want to look at it. This is a success story. Okay, I've got some time left. I could talk about the matching. I'm not going to do that in much detail. You can essentially see some results here of t-tests comparing different characteristics of workers between furloughed and non-furloughed. In our unmatched sample, there's lots of significant differences here. Okay, so furloughed people tend to be younger, paid less, and so on. Our matched sample, though, all of those differences disappear. Okay, so that's a good thing. Our algorithm seems to do a good job of balancing those characteristics. What do we find? Well, unsurprisingly, whenever we do this matching procedure, we find that there's smaller effects, and that's because of greater comparability between these two groups. Furloughed and non-furloughed workers are much more similar. And these are the results we really rely on. Okay, so furlough increases the incidence of, or the probability of being late on housing payments by 0.74 percentage points. That's about a 30% increase. And for bill payments by about 9%. Okay, so these are much smaller, and we're much more confident in claiming causality about furlough with respect to these numbers than we were before. Is that the only thing that happens? Well, simple answer is no. When someone's furloughed, they cut spending. We don't have data on how much a household spends each month, but we do have some insights into whether they've cut their spending compared to pre-COVID levels. What we observe is that furlough increases the probability that a household cuts its spending by about 20 percentage points. Okay, so that's a huge amount. And this is relative to people who are not on furloughed. Sorry, not on furlough. Now, as you probably can imagine, those people who weren't on furlough cut spending during the pandemic because they're not going to Starbucks to buy a coffee. They don't spend as much on discretionary items. But even though they're doing that, furlough still increases the probability that someone cuts spending. Interestingly, and this is something we think is really important, is that that cut to consumption persists even after someone moves back to work. Okay, so you've been furloughed, you cut consumption, you go back to work, consumption stays low. Why is that? Well, part of it could be due to changes in people's behavior. Okay, once you're furloughed, you don't spend as much on discretionary items, you can make do without them, and you don't start buying them again. Alternatively, people could be trying to restock their savings, which is something we also find. Households draw down their savings quite a lot during the furlough period, and ultimately this means that they're going to have lower savings compared to those people who weren't furloughed. So there are some wealth inequality implications of that, of the scheme. Okay. Next main result we document is what happens to furlough or to household finances after someone returns to work. Okay, so they've been furloughed, go back to work. What happens? Are they more likely to experience financial distress? Maybe, maybe not. They're now back on 100% earnings. What you can see is for late housing payments, okay, after furlough ends, these people are no more likely to experience that type of financial distress. However, for renters, they are actually less likely to be late on bill payments. So why is that? Well, one of the reasons why this likely happen is because consumption's been cut permanently by these people who were furloughed. Okay, so consumption's gone down. There's now more cash available that they can deploy to avert financial distress and pay bills. Now, we think this is a really big deal because 25% of the UK workforce has been furloughed at least once during the pandemic, and the average duration of furlough has been 6 months, more or less. That's more than enough time to provoke changes in people's behavior. So we think that this has got potentially large run ramifications for consumption, savings behavior, and financial distress in the long run. If there's a bright side of furlough, and I'm not sure there is because it must be miserable to be on it, perhaps that's one of them. Okay, got a couple of minutes, Louise? 5, okay. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but one of the things we try to do in this paper is bulletproof these results to make sure they're not driven by some other confounding factor. So there's lots of things that could correlate with furlough that also explain financial distress. To try and hone in on whether our estimates are causal in nature, we try to run some placebo checks and falsification tests. Intuitively, we should only see furlough have a significant effect on financial distress when the policy's turned on. You shouldn't observe it before someone moves on to furlough. If you do, then that's a real red flag in the data. It's telling you that this is driven by some pre-furlough trend in financial distress or anticipation behavior. We don't find any evidence of that. We also rule out a number of other potential factors that could drive these results. This is not driven by people with a history of financial distress. Okay, if you have experienced financial distress before the pandemic, you are more likely to experience it during the pandemic, but that doesn't confound the effect of furlough. This isn't driven by indebtedness. It's not driven by ex-ante savings buffers, although it's quite interesting that only 44% of people in the sample went into the pandemic with any savings at all. And for most, they would have had to accumulate savings for about 5 years to be able to overcome the shock to their wages, or the difference between what they would have earned in wages compared to what the government paid them while furloughed. This isn't driven by, say, expenditure on essentials, and those changes that we've seen in consumption and savings patterns during furlough, that also doesn't attenuate our results either. An obvious question is, well, could this just be driven by the direct effect of the pandemic? It's difficult to go to work if you're shielding, or if you're clinically vulnerable to COVID, or perhaps if you're self-isolating, or you're experiencing a local lockdown. None of that drives the results. If people do have other explanations for what we're finding here, please shout them out. We're going to journal soon, and we'd rather get criticism now rather than from a referee, because that just means we're going to spend money on submission fees for no reason. Okay, let me wrap up very quickly then. We show that furlough does influence financial distress during the pandemic, but the effects are relatively small, at least in terms of the aggregate UK economy. That's partly to do with the fact that only 25% of people are furloughed. If the incidence of that had been larger, then these effects would be proportionately bigger. I think our results also speak to the design of the furlough scheme, and obviously the government's received a lot of criticism from the House of Commons committee yesterday for its response to the COVID crisis, and quite rightly in some respects. But in terms of this scheme, it looks like this was well designed at least, and it helped a lot of workers. An obvious question is, well, what can this work say about the withdrawal of the furlough scheme? People potentially move from being furloughed to unemployed following the end of the scheme's end in September. That's not really something we can talk about, but I think what you can learn from this is something indirect. If you experience a huge shock to your income, you're probably going to experience much more financial distress, as many of these people might, compared to where you have a furlough safety net. Thank you. Hand the virtual mic back to Louise.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Danny. And thanks, Christoph, who's in the audience, whose work this also was. You packed lots in there, Danny. Thank you. And thank you for going light, very light on the equations. I'm sure lots of us here will appreciate that, but it is now time for